after the most recent war from last year between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Baku has to refrain from any arbitrary detentions in the future and to fully implement the tripartite ceasefire statement, which foresee an exchange of prisoners of war, hostages and all other detainees, as well as remains of fatalities. Despite the various definitions Azerbaijan used for these people, calling them criminals or terrorists, they are all protected by the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law and should be returned to their families. Azerbaijan should assist the European Court of Human Rights by providing with reliable information on the detainees and their well-being. It should refrain from any mistreatments or humiliation of these people. Independent and effective investigations has to be carried out for all credible allegations of grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and other violations of international law and war crimes. Baku should also close down the so-called trophy park, which exhibits degrading and dehumanizing wax figures of Armenian soldiers, which further intensify long-lasting hostilities and undermine the trust between the two countries. I would like to remind that the European Parliament has always tried to be as objective as possible. If we had reliable information that there are currently any Azerbaijani citizens in Armenian custody, we will be demanding the same things from Yerevan: immediately and unconditionally release. Every human life is precious and has to be preserved. Very soon, this House will discuss the country reports of Armenia and Azerbaijan. We are going to evaluate in our demand from today and if it have been fulfilled, and then accordingly the text of the future reports will be adopted. Thank you very much.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie pośle.
Thank you, sir. I now give the floor to the author of the resolution, Santos, for 1.5 minutes.
O conflito entre a Arménia e o Azerbaijão transformou a relação entre
The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan has marked the relationship of these countries for decades and affected the populations of both countries. The conflict last year led to 5,000 soldiers dying in barely 44 days, and many people who were forced to flee from their cities. A number were taken as prisoners of war, and that is the focus of our resolution today. There was an agreement to have an exchange of prisoners of war, hostages and other detained persons, as well as recovering the mortal remains. It is unacceptable that today there are still Armenian prisoners in Azerbaijan, and we are hearing reports of torture and degrading treatment. This is a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. We call for the unconditional release of all prisoners and for the agreement to be fully applied. Both sides must abandon their hostile rhetoric and come back to the negotiating table, working together with the Minsk group. A negotiated political solution that recognizes fundamental rights is the only way to have a peaceful and sustainable future in the region.
Next, I give the floor to the author of the resolution, Ostrovicius, for 1.5 minutes.
Madam Chair, Commissioner, dear colleagues, regrettably, conflicts and war in the South Caucasus are leading the way against dialogue, cooperation and peace. The most recent autumn war between Armenia and Azerbaijan is a tragedy resulting into grave suffering for both nations. Everything possible must be done to move from conflict to peaceful coexistence. Release of prisoners of war, hostages and other detainees is a way forward. No matter how many prisoners of war remain, human life is sacred. International commitments to the safety, health and dignity of prisoners must be upheld. One of the consequences of the conflict is deployment of so-called Russian peacekeepers to Nagorno-Karabakh, which raises another equally worrisome security concerns. Russia's presence might turn into a long-term process. The European Union was a passive observer of the conflict and did not use its influence to prevent it. The European Union must initiate and actively participate in the peace process and help its highly valued Eastern partners, Armenia and Azerbaijan, to meet the needs of their people, which include confidence building, cooperation and a lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to author of the resolution, Van Kamon Taubadel. 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, dear colleagues. War is ugly and unjust. Thousands of killed soldiers from Armenia and Azerbaijan and many more displaced civilians. That is the price of what President Aliyev calls an unprecedented victory. Mr. President Aliyev, nothing suits a true winner more than humility to extend a helping hand to its defeated enemy. Not only because it is morally correct, but also it is strategically wise. True winners know that dehumanizing the enemy in trophy parks and crossing the border only extend the vicious circles of violence. True winners know that indoctrinating your children with hate only maintains war, and that short-sighted revenge will never lead into solid peace. And they also know that unjust done to displaced Azeris can never justify similar unjust against Armenians. So true winners know that every human life counts, no matter of which ethnicity. President Aliyev, there was once a long-standing friendship between Armenians and Azeris. So you have a chance now to be a true winner. Embrace your defeated enemy and turn them into loyal friends again. Because if Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijani, and it is, you are responsible for all the well-being of all of its inhabitants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, I give the floor to the author of the resolution, Barrena Arza. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. The attack against Nagorno-Karabakh by the Azeri government ended upon an agreement between the parties that has not been respected by Azerbaijan. Around 200 Armenians are still held in captivity by Azerbaijan. These prisoners of war are being mistreated by the Azeri military, and there are allegations that prisoners have been subjected to extrajudicial killings or enforced disappearance that constitute war crimes. It's time for this parliament to demand to Azerbaijan the immediate and unconditional release of all Armenian prisoners detained during and after the conflict, full implementation of the ceasefire agreement, and to refrain from further military intrusion in Armenian territory. As the joint motion for a resolution states, a long-standing political negotiated solution based on the principles of non-use of force, territorial integrity, and the equal rights and self-determination of peoples is crucial to determine the future status of Artsakh. A comprehensive political solution will be needed, but meanwhile we have to expose the Turkish Azeri aggression against Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're still talking about Azerbaijan, Armenia. Next, Weimers for 1 minute speaking time.
Thank you, Madam President. OSCE acting chair and Sweden's foreign minister, Ann Linde, called for, and I quote, the sides to urgently complete exchange of detainees, end quote. Sides? How many Azerbaijani prisoners of war does Armenia have yet to return? Dear Minister Linda, there is only one side in this conflict that completely disregards international humanitarian law, and that is Azerbaijan. And Linda, as a foreign minister and acting OSCE chair, I ask you as co-author of this resolution of the European Parliament to heed this resolution and call upon Azerbaijan to immediately and unconditionally release all Armenian prisoners, both military and civilian, detained during and after the conflict. Diplomacy is no excuse to conceal the truth. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie pośle, w imieniu Grupy Europejskiej.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the EPP, next, Van de Kendelara has the floor for 1 minute. President, colleagues, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh has been dragging on for far too long and is a major concern for the European Union, particularly with respect to the repatriation of the prisoners of war. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the fate of the prisoners of war and the failed way that the Azeri authorities have acted. Let us be clear. The Armenian prisoners of war cannot be labeled criminals so that you get around international law. Both Azerbaijan and Armenia are partners in our eastern policy, and eastern neighbors, of course, cannot fight each other. We need to put sufficient pressure on Azerbaijan. And of course, they cannot remain entirely unpunished. I think that maximum investigation on the criminal human rights violations and the French co-presidency, I think, would have to be particularly courageous when it comes to the difference that the EU makes. The External Service is called upon to make greater efforts to contribute towards the return of these individuals and this putting an end to this unacceptable situation. Thank you very much, sir. Next, on behalf of the SND Group, Karl Jurand has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President, Commissioner, colleagues. War is never a good solution. It might bring a short-term victory, but it also brings unnecessary deaths, suffering, and takes time to heal wounds. Let me focus on 3 very urgent issues in this context. First, the need to release all Armenian prisoners of war and other detainees. I urge Azerbaijan to fulfil its international obligations, including the ceasefire agreement and ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, which has granted interim measures with respect to more than 200 Armenian individuals. Second, the inflammatory rhetoric and spreading of hatred needs to stop. The military trophy park in Baku is the most serious example of it. It humiliates and dehumanizes Armenians, glorifies violence and teaches wrong lessons to Azerbaijani kids. It has to be removed. Third, the border incident and ongoing crisis at the southern interstate border are deeply worrying. I urge Azerbaijan to withdraw and start proper border negotiations with Armenia. Removing these obstacles will bring closer so much awaited peace and reconciliation to people of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani poseł, w imieniu Grupy Renew Europe.
On behalf of the Renew Group, the next speaker will be Kyuchuk for 1 minute speaking time.
Thank you, Madam President, dear Commissioner, colleagues. For a long time, Azerbaijan and Armenia have been walking the Nagorno-Karabakh territorial conflict that led to the loss of life, including civilian population, internally displaced people, and many sufferings from both sides. The European Parliament has always stood for the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity, and I welcome the agreement from November 2020 on a complete ceasefire in Nagorno-Karabakh. Despite the fact that the changes to the status quo were made through military force rather than peaceful negotiations, we have to admit that Azerbaijan acted exclusively within its internationally recognized borders. I hope that this agreement will open now a brighter perspective for a peaceful settlement and good neighbourly relations in the future. However, recent developments show us that the confrontation is far from over. Therefore, I urge the European Union to play an active and important role in this conflict. Thank you, Madam.
Dziękuję bardzo pani pośle. W imieniu grupy Tożsamość i Demokracja głos zabierze pani poseł Silvia Sardone.
Thank you. I'll give the floor to Silvia Sardone.
It is a scandal that Europe does not raise its voice against the ethnic and religious cleansing that Christian Armenia is facing. As Azerbaijan and Turkey are engaging in Islamism, there are 250 odd Armenian soldiers that have been taken and not returned. Houses destroyed, churches desecrated and destroyed, tombs and graveyards destroyed as well. Crimes against humanity, with mutilations, decapitations of civilians and soldiers, systematic destruction of Christian monuments. They show just how fanatic the aggressors are. The leaders of Azerbaijan have engaged in a macabre enterprise that no one before had conceived of. The park of military trophies are a museum of hate with wax models of murdered Armenian soldiers. It seems that we care in this House more about Islamophobia than persecuted Christians. Here again, the European Parliament always seems to bow down to Erdogan, who does not recognize the Armenian genocide. He is using this war to show off his own strength. Europe has been warned. Silence about what is happening in those lands is a further sign of ever-growing submission to Turkey. There is a heritage is being destroyed and European civilization is being attacked.
Wolne Przymierze Europejskie. Głos zabierze pan poseł Jordi Sole.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Greens group, Jordi Sole has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. 6 months after the ceasefire, the situation on the ground remains fragile, as the recent incursion of the Azeri army into Armenian territory shows. The issue of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh is far from being settled. War is being glorified and hatred against Armenians incited in the so-called trophy park. And the government of Azerbaijan refuses to comply with international obligations, unlawfully keeping prisoners of war and civilian captives. All Armenian prisoners, military or civilian, detained during or after the conflict have to be immediately and unconditionally released. The security of the Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh has to be ensured by all means, as well as their cultural heritage protected. The final status of Artsakh cannot be imposed by force of arms. There has to be a political solution that takes into account the democratic will of the population living there. At the time of the ceasefire, the EU was simply absent. Now it's time for us to engage in the peace process in order to bring about stabilization, reconciliation, and a fair settlement. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Thank you very much. Now for the ECR group, Mr. Czarnecki, 1 minute.
Madam Chair, Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, I was many times, a dozen of times, in both these countries and in the countries of South Caucasus. I was there more than 20 times, so my knowledge is not of academic nature, not of theoretical nature. I know these people, I know these countries, I know the history, and I would warn you against very easy simplifications, judgments of this kind, which to us, to the people of the West, generally speaking, sometimes they come to our minds without too much reflection. I need to say that we are politicians here at this chamber, although many of us would like to be ombudsmen, would have to remember about the geopolitical context. What is good for Russia? For Russia, it's good to push these countries into the Russian sphere of influence, and I would like to warn you against this.
Dankeschön. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Konechna for 1 minute. For the left group.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Madam Commissioner, dear colleagues, exchanging prisoners of war is an essential part of finding a peaceful coexistence between two hostile parties. It creates an atmosphere of trust, and it is an act of hope that forceful military solutions are not a reasonable path among civilized countries. So under no circumstances is it possible to side with a party that refuses agreements on exchanging of prisoners of war or who violates these agreements. It is a diplomatic, political, and above all human mistake. The unwillingness to participate in these exchanges gives a signal that for at least one of the parties the conflict is not over and it can be restarted very soon, which is not acceptable. It is also necessary to stand against the practice of countries refusing to report their prisoners of war and therefore keeping them secret. These practices are unfortunate and despicable. I hope that after bloody lessons of past times, everyone should adhere to certain human principles, and solidarity demonstrated by exchanging prisoners of war is one of those principles.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Castaldo, but he doesn't appear to be in the chamber. Unless he's going to shout out. No, okay. We'll take Mr. Bellamy for 1 minute then.
Mes chers collègues, enfin, nous avons réussi à mettre...
Colleagues, finally we've managed to put this urgent humanitarian issue on our agenda. Azerbaijani and Azeri prisoners kept against the very letter and spirit of the treaties of Geneva. And there are pretexts that there are terrorists involved, but the only terrorists involved are the ones that Erdogan has funded to attack Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan are refusing to say how many people are still held captive. In Armenia, there are hundreds of families who are in anguish. They don't know if their sons are dead, are captured, are one of the many victims of terrorism and torture. Narek, Nurik, Yerevan, there are several people who we are worried about, and the International Federation of Human Rights is worried about them. Aliyev talks about peace and respect, but how can we believe this when today he's still violating the border of Armenia? There's no reason, there's no disagreement, no diplomacy can excuse that abuse of fundamental rights. The prisoners of war have to be released without any delay.
Next.
Thank you very much. This next speaker is Mr. Groshel. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, it's rather simple. International law states that after the conflict is over, all conflict parties must enable the repatriation of prisoners of war. The international law also has an instrument to do this. It's the Red Cross Committee. They should have registers of such people. Azerbaijan can use any excuse they want, but the only way they can find their path back to the international community and find a way to solve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is to let the Red Cross register all prisoners of war from Armenia in their prisons. They have to make sure that these prisoners are repatriated and released immediately. All other paths only lead to the deepening of the conflict. Thank you.
Danke sehr.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Poremba for 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are discussing an important issue of respecting international law and the letter of the agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. This should only be the subject of our resolution, because the question of exchange of prisoners of war, of course, is obvious and it should take place as soon as possible. But we must remember that the last time round, the there was a huge campaign of disinformation, and therefore there is a need of investigation, because otherwise we wouldn't be sure if what we are talking about is true. So I don't know why this resolution includes a number of secondary issues. For example, the question of the status of the Nagorno-Karabakh or the role that the Union should play. But the resolution lacks the information of on 4 Azeri soldiers accused of violating human rights. This resolution is not excellent, and therefore we will vote against.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Mr. Berg, for 1 minute.
Madam President, Madam Commissioner, on the 19th of March, Human Rights Watch reported on the mistreatment of Armenian prisoners of war through the forces of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has not been following the rules of the ceasefire, and the remaining Armenian prisoners are being considered as terrorism suspects. The European Court of Human Rights considers that Azerbaijan is not living up to its international commitments, and I am convinced that it's the responsibility of this House to examine which measures should be taken in order to respond rapidly in future to these kinds of situations. It's a state that is contravening an international agreement and is contravening human rights, and it is on the verge of an abyss. President Aliyev has to show that he is a statesman, a real statesman, a statesman which is prepared to return immediately the remaining prisoners who are considered as terrorism suspects.
Thank you very much. Mr. van Dalen now for 1 minute.
Merci.
President, our message today is very clear. Azerbaijan must release all prisoners of war, both civilian and military, unconditionally. Liberate them. Full stop. Moreover, Azerbaijan has to make sure that this repulsive park of trophies be closed immediately. On the back of Armenian prisoners of war and soldiers, a humiliating exhibition is being manifested. It is absolutely repulsive. That park has to be closed. President, I'm also pleased that we're having a debate today with a resolution, because we stand by the people of Armenia. The European Union must not turn a blind eye to the injustice that is being exploited. Thank you. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Ponsati Obiols, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissary. The people of Nagorno-Karabakh have the fundamental right to peacefully and democratically decide their future. Resolving border problems between neighbors violently doesn't work. The ceasefire agreement of November last year must be respected, and it is urgent that Azerbaijan abides by the Geneva Convention and the Armenian prisoners of war are liberated. The EU cannot continue to sit and watch. We must get involved to help constructing a lasting solution for the region. Recognition of the Armenian genocide of 1915 is a necessary first step, and it is equally indispensable that member states like Spain, that actively opposed sanctions to Turkey last autumn, stop supporting Erdogan's strategy of conflict for his benefit. If Europe wants to promote peaceful and democratic solutions rather than conflict, European support to Turkey must end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have Mr. Kimperopoulos for 1 minute, remote.
Συνάδελφοι, κατά τη διάρκεια του 2020, με ευθύνη του Αζερμπαϊτζάν εγκαταλείφθηκε ο διάλογος που διεξαγόταν από την ομάδα του Μίνσκ για την ειρηνική διευθέτηση.
Unfortunately, the connection is extremely poor and it's very difficult to hear the speaker. When violence is used, both against civilians and military personnel. This was the case when mercenaries were sent by Turkey to the conflict, and this led to prisoners of war being taken captive, and they have still not been released. They must absolutely be freed and returned to their homes, but the EU has not taken a stand on this and has taken no action, even in light of what Turkey and Aliyev did. So the EU must now say clearly that we are willing to take action. We must call for the release of the Armenian prisoners of war, and we must call on Azerbaijan to respect international rule of law and to cease using any form of violence.
Thank you very much. I apologise for the technical problems at the start of that transmission. Now we have Mr. Foulas for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. When Aliyev and Erdogan's war machine flattened Nagorno-Karabakh with its drones and mercilessly beat the Armenians, including civilians, Europe was absent. When the leaders of Azerbaijan and Turkey celebrated their crimes, Europe just stood by and watched. Today, many months later, hundreds of Armenians remain captive in Aliyev's hands, with Azerbaijan refusing to give them back to their families. Listen to me, in Cyprus, when the Turks invaded in 1974, they took thousands of prisoners and hundreds of them never came back. Even today, we are recovering the bones of our dead from the fields and from the mass graves. So let's not wait. Let's not wait for Aliyev to return the prisoners. He won't do it unless he is forced to do so. I call upon you to save the dignity of Europe. I call upon you to stand by the Armenian people and to call for the Armenians to be returned to their families. We are all Armenians.
Castaldo. Now Mr. Castaldo, who's arrived. 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente, gentile Commissario.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, well, on the 8th of November in Baku, there was a major national celebration commemorating the aggressive war in Nagorno-Karabakh. There's a very strange slogan that was chanted about Karabakh being part of Azerbaijan. Now, we have the situation with Armenian soldiers taken as prisoners of war. They are not being returned. They are many disproportionate measures being taken by the Azerbaijanis. This sounds like a nightmare, but it is a reality. So we must condemn in absolute terms the exhibition that the Azerbaijan has set up on war trophies. This is one of the darkest moments of Europe's history, and we call for the immediate release of prisoners of war, which should not be used as hostages for blackmail. They must immediately close this museum of war trophies, which I think cannot be called a museum, and I called upon the European Parliament to act solidly.
Thank you very much. Now for the Commission. Commissioner Dalli has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, members of the European Parliament, for raising the issue of prisoners of war and other detainees in the aftermath of the 2020 hostilities. We took good note of the letter of more than 120 members of this House on the same issue. The EU has taken a clear position. We have repeatedly called on both parties to fully implement the ceasefire agreement. We have also called on them to exchange prisoners of war and to release all remaining detainees, regardless of the circumstances of their capture, in accordance with international humanitarian law and the ceasefire agreement. The release of all Armenian detainees is essential for building confidence and trust and would be an important political gesture. We welcomed the release of 5 Armenian detainees on the 29th of January and of 3 on the 4th of May. We insist that all remaining detainees be released without further delay. The EU expects both parties to cooperate not only on the return of detainees, but also on other important humanitarian issues. The recovery and repatriation of remains of the missing should continue. Urgent and decisive steps are needed on the exchange of information necessary for the conduct of humanitarian and demining, including de-sharing of any available maps of minefields to enable return to areas devastated by conflict. To diffuse tensions and allow societies to progress towards normalisation, it is also crucially important to refrain from inflammatory public rhetoric. The EU has called for accountability for any violation of international humanitarian law. Allegations of torture, ill treatment or execution of captives and any other war crimes that might have been committed during the recent hostilities must be thoroughly investigated. The EU stands ready to contribute to international and independent justice mechanisms and to support an independent investigation into such claims. The cessation of hostilities and addressing the range of immediate humanitarian issues is only a first step to end the long-lasting Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Renewed efforts for a negotiated, comprehensive and sustainable settlement are needed. The EU fully supports the OSCE Minsk group led by its co-chairs, and we stand ready to contribute in the shaping of a durable and comprehensive settlement, including through support for stabilisation and confidence-building measures. I thank you.
Herzlichen Dank, Frau Kommissarin.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. That brings to an end this debate. The vote will be held today. The next debate on the agenda is the situation in Haiti.